The Third Reich saw the rise of figures who embodied the horror of a regime determined to exterminate millions. Some of Adolf Hitler's most notorious henchmen were Josef Mengele, the doctor who turned science into an instrument of torture; Irma Gräser, the young guard whose sadistic actions in concentration camps made her a symbol of evil; and Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, whose cold planning facilitated the machinery of death. Nevertheless, the devastation would not have been successful if the Führer had not counted on thousands of minds, hands, and wills. Other lesser-mentioned figures also played a leading role. For instance, the 1930s still recalled the moment Amon Goeth joined the Nazi Party in Austria, a step that would launch him onto a dark path. But when he joined the SS, he reached a rank few would dare imagine. In those days, Goeth was just another member of that machinery, though soon his name would resonate in power circles for his relentless dedication. The nature of his actions earned him a rapid promotion, a kind of recognition that led him to command the Krakow-Płaszów camp. When Amon was assigned as Einsatzführer in Silesia in mid-1941, his mission seemed simple: to ensure the ethnic cleansing of the Jews in the region, supervising and accounting for every soul sent to the abyss. His days turned into a routine of cold-blooded murder, signing deportation orders as if he were distributing bus tickets for travelers. In February 1943, he was tasked with expanding the Płaszów camp, and soon this site became a symbol of hopelessness and horror. Goeth seemed to relish a sense of power that transcended any boundary. From the balcony of his villa, with an almost theatrical calm, he looked down at the prisoners struggling to survive each day of forced labor. There he raised his rifle as if he were an experienced hunter, aiming and shooting with calculated precision, watching the bodies collapse to the ground, all before the impassive gaze of the guards. It was a game to him, a private spectacle where suffering was the price to be paid. On March 17, 1943, the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto took place. Goeth, at the head of his troops, ordered the mass execution of thousands of people without stopping to think even for a moment about the terrified faces watching. Mothers tried to protect their children, the elderly could barely stand. It was a carnage of such magnitude that even the soldiers accompanying him seemed to wish to look away. And he, impassive, watched as the bodies were dragged out of sight. Under his command at Płaszów, executions became a daily act. Each day, Goeth coldly decided who should live and who should die. He once ordered a sick young man to eat his own excrement as punishment, only to shoot him as soon as he finished. In 1944, he was granted the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer, a promotion that skipped a rank, awarded not only for following orders but for his particular zeal in fulfilling them. Goeth had made Płaszów his personal fiefdom, a kingdom where each whip, each summary execution, and each shot seemed to be a tribute to his own thirst for power. On one occasion, he ordered every 10th prisoner to be executed as a collective punishment simply because one of them had tried to escape. In addition to his boundless violence, Goeth devoted himself to looting the belongings of Jewish families in the ghettos. When his name arose in conversation, it was inevitably associated with the plundering of jewelry, furniture, and any other valuable object. Goeth filled his pockets while thousands of lives were reduced to ashes. His enrichment at the expense of others' pain made him even more feared. Ironically, that same greed ultimately led the very regime he defended to accuse him of corruption. Gestapo officials, even within the Nazi framework, could not ignore his constant theft, his obsession with hoarding goods that did not belong to him. He was arrested on charges of embezzlement in 1944. As the war drew to a close, Amon Goeth was captured by the Allies. His trial, like those of many other war criminals, was a moment of revelation, an attempt at justice in the face of the magnitude of the crimes committed. When he heard the death sentence, Goeth maintained a haughty gaze, as if he still believed the world owed him reverence. On September 23, 1946, he was led to the gallows. The noose tightened around his neck, and the man who had once decided over life and death met the fate he had imposed so many times. Goeth was buried in anonymity, his remains mixed with the earth like the most anonymous of mortals, while the camp that had once been his personal fiefdom crumbled into silent ruins. The personification of ruthlessness, Dirlewanger's legacy in the Third Reich. He was not just any soldier. Oskar Dirlewanger was a full representative of the SS uniform, and his career would soon demonstrate it with each promotion, each act of brutality, each mission. His story begins in the trenches of World War I, when he was still a young lieutenant in the German army, accumulating scars and medals like the Iron Cross, an award that seemed to promise a brilliant career. In 1939, as Nazism erected its war curtain across Europe, Oskar joined the ranks of the SS, obtaining the rank of SS Untersturmführer. However, he did not take long to ascend the hierarchy, thanks to an unusual special command created by Heinrich Himmler and Gottlob Berger, the Dirlewanger Brigade, a unit composed not of heroes or brave soldiers but of criminals and poachers. In 1940, as the Nazi war machine advanced over Poland, Dirlewanger received a promotion, SS Obersturmführer. Under his command, the men of the Dirlewanger Brigade became infamous for their atrocious methods in the hunting of partisans in Poland and Belarus, although hunting would be an understatement. What they carried out was a ruthless cleansing, without distinction between combatants and civilians. It was said that villages emptied as they passed, that children and the elderly became fodder for fire and bullets, and that no soul, not even the innocent, was spared from the fury of that squad of killers. The atrocity in Belarus surpassed all expectations. Dirlewanger and his brigade unleashed a hell of such magnitude that reports spoke of 30,000 dead in just a few months, victims not only of mass executions but also of sadistic methods. They entrenched themselves in villages, razing them. They set fire to barns filled with villagers who in vain tried to escape the flames, only to find themselves met by the spray of machine guns waiting for them. It was estimated that around 200 villages were erased from the map under Dirlewanger's command, who saw each peasant as a potential enemy and each home as a nest of traitors. In the end, he left over 120,000 corpses in his wake, like trophies of a war that only he seemed to understand with such coldness. By then, he was renowned as a monster among monsters. Reports did not stop at his massacres, but also detailed the perverse nature of his way of operating. He took women as spoils of war, treating young girls as mere playthings for his men. In his own words, he called them sexual livestock. It was August 1944 when Dirlewanger received his final promotion, the rank of SS Oberführer, an official recognition that sealed his reputation. From then on, he was entrusted with a mission that would mark his infamy forever, to crush the Warsaw Uprising. The Polish capital had resisted the invader with tooth and nail, and the SS decided it was time to teach a definitive lesson. Dirlewanger led his brigade into the burning city, knowing that this time the eyes of history were upon him. The massacre in the Wola district was only one example of Dirlewanger's unleashed fury. In a matter of days, his men slaughtered nearly 40,000 civilians, as if the resistance of an entire people was a personal affront to him. The scene was nightmarish. Hospitals burning with patients and doctors still inside, women in the streets subjected to the atrocities of his soldiers, while children lay dead with the marks of rifle butts. Stories circulated of soldiers who, under his orders, poured gasoline over prisoners and burned them alive in bonfires. But this was not the end of his bloody crusade. Shortly after Warsaw, he was called to quell another uprising, this time in Slovakia, where partisans challenged the Third Reich. And although the magnitude of his crimes already echoed within the SS ranks, no one had the courage to stop him. He continued his path of destruction, applying the same tactics, a combination of terror and annihilation that seemed to have become his own creed. As the end of the war approached, Dirlewanger was no longer seen in the same light by his superiors. His methods, once tolerated as a necessary evil, now caused discomfort, even among those who had once promoted and praised him. However, post-war justice was not clearly applied in his case. The accounts of his final fate are unclear. Some claim he was captured and executed by French partisans in 1945, while others suggest he escaped, lost in time and space, as if the devil himself had claimed him. Among documents and testimonies, his name remains synonymous with unparalleled cruelty, a war where even the boundaries of evil seemed to blur in the face of a lust for power and destruction. A whip lashing through Europe, Brunner and his role in the SS. Alois Brunner was the kind of man who never took a single misstep. Improvisation was not his style, rather he embodied meticulous precision, a sort of artisan of horror, At the peak of his career in the 1930s and 1940s, he wore his SS uniform with the cold confidence of someone convinced of his purpose. And that purpose was nothing other than the complete elimination of the Jewish community in Europe. As an SS Hauptsturmführer, Brunner held a significant rank within the Nazi machine, and his authority allowed him to occupy some of the most pivotal roles in the implementation of the Holocaust. He began as an employee at the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in 1938, in a Vienna where the days of tolerance were nothing more than memories. For Brunner, however, this was an opportunity, and a very grim one. Organizing deportations from Austria seemed to be a task he performed without the slightest hesitation. Within a few years, his efficiency became evident, and in 1942 he became the director of the office. His masterpiece at this stage was the deportation of approximately 56,000 Jews to various concentration camps. By October of that same year, it was said that Vienna had been cleansed of Jews. That phrase was his way of declaring to the world that the city, once bustling and diverse, was no longer the same. But Vienna was only the beginning for Brunner. In 1943, his mission took him to the Greek shores, to the city of Thessaloniki, where he applied the same formula of cleansing with his characteristic efficiency and brutality. In just 2 months, nearly 43,000 Greek Jews were torn from their homes and lives and sent on trains toward their disappearance in Auschwitz. The sun and sea of that city did not soften his task. For him, it was merely another step in the assignment entrusted to him. Shortly after, he was given another role, this time in France. In the summer of 1943, Brunner took command of the Drancy internment camp on the outskirts of Paris. His reputation preceded him, and very soon terror spread among the prisoners. His office in Drancy was a macabre scene. Blood-stained walls, bullet marks that seemed to serve as reminders of his cruelty. Prisoners of all ages and conditions suffered under his command, where any infraction, however small, could be punished with violence. Rumors claimed that he himself carried out the interrogations, employing a variety of torture methods that, for many, were a prelude to the end. Not content with his brutality, in July 1944, Brunner showed that the extent of his evil knew no bounds. He ordered the deportation of hundreds of children, many of them orphans, to Auschwitz. Not even the most innocent escaped his sentence. This was one of his last moves before the liberation of Paris, and although Allied troops were already advancing toward the city, Brunner remained unwavering in his purpose. For him, those trains loaded with children were not a defeat, but a final victory. Just days before the liberation, he sent 1,327 more children to the extermination camps. He seemed determined to empty Drancy to the last. Nevertheless, the horror did not end there. When the Allies approached, Brunner fled France and headed for another tragic destination, Slovakia. There, in the Sered concentration camp, he resumed his work of extermination. This time, the victims were mostly Slovak Jews, and Brunner wasted no time. From late 1944 until the end of the war, he organized the deportation of approximately 11,500 more prisoners, sending them to the furnaces of Auschwitz. During these years, Brunner's relationship with Adolf Eichmann was crucial. He was Eichmann's right-hand man, his confidant in the art of extermination. They communicated directly, without the need to follow common hierarchical structures. Brunner was one of the few who enjoyed such trust, and it was said that his commitment to the final solution was as unyielding as that of his mentor. Thus, in more than one place, Eichmann's decisions were enacted through Brunner's hands. One of the darkest episodes of his career involved a sick Jewish financier who, unable to endure the journey to Riga, was left behind at one of the stations. Brunner showed no mercy. He approached the man and, after a brief humiliation, executed him with a gunshot. The war ended and many sought justice, but Alois Brunner would not be caught so easily. He was tried in absentia and sentenced to death for his crimes, but by then he had already disappeared, becoming a ghost who eluded every attempt to capture him. He took refuge in Syria under a false name, where apparently he found a quiet life. Over the years, his appearances grew fewer, though there was never a place for repentance. Until his last days, he held his convictions intact, showing no remorse for the crimes he had committed. Finally, rumors suggested that he died around 2001, without ever facing trial. without ever answering for the thousands of dead left in his wake. A desk and office executioner, Rudolf Hess and his complicity with the Führer. The early days of Rudolf Hess in the Nazi Party paint a picture of almost blind loyalty. It was 1920 when Hess joined this political faction, an insignificant organization at the time that was slowly paving a path toward power, driven by speeches filled with nationalist fervor. He was a young man fascinated by the words of Adolf Hitler, who gradually became his hero, father figure, and only political guide. Hess did not hesitate for a moment to place himself among the first ranks of the Nazi Party, absorbing every word from Hitler as if it were a divine revelation. But the true beginning of his political career occurred 3 years later in 1923, during the infamous Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. In his attempt to contribute to the uprising aimed at overthrowing the Weimar Republic, Hess ended up trapped alongside Hitler in a Bavarian prison after the failed coup. Far from being a defeat, that imprisonment forged an unbreakable loyalty between them and gave them time to devise the pillars of an ideology that would soon spread like spilled water across Germany. With Hitler as Chancellor in 1933, Hess saw his loyalty rewarded. He was appointed Deputy Führer, a title that was not merely symbolic but gave him great influence over the decisions of the party and government. One could say that Hess became the second most powerful man in the Nazi regime, a role few could match. Although he did not make autonomous decisions, his hands signed decrees that would seal the fate of millions. That same year, Hitler conferred upon him the rank of Obergruppenführer in the SS, a title reflecting his authority within the paramilitary organization, though Hess never wore a uniform or actively participated in the brutal actions of the SS. He preferred to operate within offices and cabinets, where his influence allowed him to manipulate the machinery of laws and decrees. A few months later, he received another title, Reichsleiter, elevating him further in the Nazi Party hierarchy, granting him a visibility that only some of Hitler's most loyal followers achieved. From his privileged position, Hess began to play an active role in the promulgation of racial and expansionist policies, which represented the core of Nazi ideology. In 1935, he signed, along with other high-ranking officials, the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews of their citizenship and condemned them to a life of marginalization and persecution. However, Hess preferred to ignore the magnitude of the horror these laws would unleash in the years to come. For him, signing these laws was merely another step in his loyal following of Hitler's orders. World War II brought an even darker phase. In 1939, Hess joined the Council of Ministers for Reich Defense, a sort of war cabinet responsible for coordinating the regime's military strategies. Although he was not a military strategist, his role in this council was that of a politician who legitimized the aggressive actions of the Third Reich. In his high-ranking position, he endorsed decisions of invasion and annexation, such as those of Austria and Czechoslovakia. But as Hess strove to prove his loyalty, Hitler began to see him with a mixture of distance and disdain. Perhaps the Führer perceived in him a devotion that was too submissive, or maybe he simply sought to surround himself with more warlike men, those who could make violence their primary tool. Then came May 10, 1941, and Rudolf Hess became the protagonist of one of the war's strangest episodes. Without consulting Hitler or the High Command, Hess boarded a plane and flew to Scotland in a desperate attempt to negotiate peace with the United Kingdom. This act was not only seen as treason in Hitler's eyes, but also as a sign of the desperation that had begun to consume Hess. He dreamed of peace, of an agreement that could protect the Reich and consolidate Germany's power in Europe. However, that flight was in vain. Upon landing on British soil, Hess was arrested, and his dreams of peace were quickly dismissed by both sides. The news of his detention spread through Germany like an incredible rumor. Furious and humiliated, Hitler ordered any trace of Hess to be erased from the party's upper ranks. The former deputy Führer became a pariah, an inconvenient figure whose existence would be denied and forgotten by the regime. From that moment on, Hess was relegated to a British cell without visits, letters, or the slightest contact with the outside world. The end of the war brought him before the Nuremberg tribunal, where he was tried alongside other Nazi leaders. During the trial, Hess displayed a strange mixture of amnesia and arrogance, behaving as if his actions had been mere trivial decisions of a low-level official. Despite the charges against him, His defense tried to portray an image of blind obedience to Hitler's orders, as if his role in the Nazi machinery had been purely administrative and harmless. However, the judges were not convinced by his weak attempt to absolve himself, and Hess was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against peace. Years later, Hess would become the last prisoner in Spandau prison in West Berlin. By that time, he was just a lonely, aging man who clung to his memories. The white coat and stethoscope in the service of horror, the executioner of Mauthausen. Aribert Heim was one of those doctors who, under the Nazi insignia, left a trail of suffering. Nicknamed Dr. Death and the Butcher of Mauthausen, Heim used his white coat and knowledge to defy the boundaries of ethics and humanity, becoming an executioner disguised as a healer. His first assignment at the Mauthausen concentration camp in October 1941 was brief, but marked the beginning of a feared career in those times. At Mauthausen, Heim was in charge of attending to the prisoners, but his role quickly shifted toward an obsession with experiments. Here, in the camp's pavilions, where the smoke from the crematoria was a constant presence in the air, Heim began implementing his inhumane practices. Lethal injections were one of his favorite methods. With a needle in hand, he injected substances like gasoline or phenol directly into the prisoners' hearts. Each injection was a timed act. Most of the time, the prisoners died slowly, while he observed the effects without a single hint of empathy, only with the impassive interest of a twisted scientist. Survivor and witness accounts tell of how Heim carried a kind of stopwatch during these macabre sessions. Time was crucial to measure reactions, complications, side effects, and above all, survival. His dedication to science led him to perform unnecessary and brutal surgeries, stripped of anesthesia and any motivation beyond cruelty. Perhaps the most chilling case was that of a young man with a simple foot inflammation. Heim anesthetized him, but what followed was a typical horror story. He extracted organs and decapitated him. He placed part of the young man's body on his desk as a trophy. Not satisfied with Mauthausen, Heim was transferred to the Wannsee concentration camp in December of the same year. This new destination was not a relief for the prisoners, but rather the continuation of a torment that many already described with horror. In Wannsee, he replicated Mauthausen's torture methods and added new experiments that bordered on the absurd. Throughout his career, Heim maintained close ties with other members of the SS Medical Corps, especially Erich Wasicki, an SS pharmacist who shared his twisted vision of human life. Together they refined experimentation techniques and tests that only served one purpose: to increase their victims' suffering. Accounts speak of how they tested injections with paralyzing agents on prisoners, observing how life faded amid spasms and agony. Compared to Josef Mengele, Heim showed an even more ruthless methodology, if such a thing were possible. Both shared a similar line of work, a twisted companionship. The horror reached its peak when Heim began collecting body parts from his victims. The heads of prisoners, particularly those with perfect teeth, became trophies in his collection. Some testimonies also indicate that he used the tattooed skin of prisoners to make decorations, a practice that painted Heim as one of the most depraved doctors of his time. However, the end of the war brought with it a kind of belated justice. Aribert Heim was captured by American forces, yet fate allowed him one last escape. After a brief time in detention, Heim managed to flee, leaving behind the shadows of Mauthausen and Wannsee, and his whereabouts became a mystery. For decades, authorities searched for him, but Heim evaded justice by adopting a false identity and finding refuge in foreign lands. He spent the last years of his life in Egypt, under the name Tarek Hussein Farid, living in an apparent calm that contrasted sharply with the echoes of horror resonating from his past. There, among the dusty, distant streets of Cairo, Heim found the anonymity and peace he so longed for, protected by a disguise that rendered him unrecognizable to the world. Rumors about his whereabouts never ceased. Intelligence agencies and Nazi hunters devoted their resources to tracking him down, but Heim had built an impenetrable refuge, a shadow of his former self. Ironically, death caught up with him in 1992, not in a courtroom, but in the bed of an Egyptian hospital. Efficiency in the Third Reich, von Küchler and his legacy of terror. Under the sky of a war-torn Europe, the name Georg von Küchler was etched into one of the darkest chapters of German military history. His career began to take shape in 1938 as General of Artillery and commander of the 1st Military District in East Prussia, a region simmering with war rumors. With a rigid sense of duty, Küchler reinforced local defenses, ignoring the whispers about the true objectives of the regime he served. In September 1939, Küchler took a decisive step into the abyss by assuming command of the Third Army. German cannons thundered as they crossed the Polish border, and during their advance, Küchler oversaw the capture of Danzig. Polish civilians and soldiers barely had time to comprehend the assault. What followed was not merely a military campaign, but a display of meticulously executed terror. Under his command, German soldiers began to see the population not as people, but as obstacles to be removed. By November of that same year, Küchler was appointed commander of the 18th Army, as Germany prepared for its next target, the Netherlands. Without remorse, his gaze was already fixed on the next destination, with the certainty of one who knows that sacrifice is a price to be paid, even if others are the ones who pay it. Orders arrived from the highest levels, dictating that every inch of conquered ground had to be purged of any trace of resistance, and Küchler executed them without question. In January 1942, he assumed command of Army Group North, taking over from Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb. Leningrad was within his reach, but the city refused to submit. Küchler, now bearing the rank of Generalfeldmarschall following a promotion in June that year, understood that the only way to defeat Leningrad was through starvation, despair, and isolation. Thus began the siege that would last nearly 900 days. The suffering of 1 million people trapped in the inferno of a besieged city was buried in the pages of reports. The Nazi directives became increasingly clear. The war against the Soviet enemy was not only territorial, but ideological. With calculated coldness, Küchler began implementing the Hunger Plan, ensuring that the occupied lands in the east would provide resources to the Third Reich, regardless of the cost to local populations. In the midst of winter, thousands of Soviet civilians were left without bread or hope. The soldiers reporting to him spoke of entire families reduced to walking skeletons, wandering in search of food. But to Küchler, they were merely collateral damage. The harshness of his methods reached a new level with the order to implement the Hunger Plan mercilessly. Rations were scarce, and what little remained went directly to his troops, leaving local civilians abandoned to their fate. Reports from his officers mentioned staggering numbers, thousands of Soviet prisoners of war perishing from starvation, cold, and exhaustion. Amid the chaos on the Eastern Front, the army under his command collaborated with the dreaded Einsatzgruppen units. Mass graves multiplied in the forests and fields of the Baltics, where the gunfire of the Wehrmacht and SS squads mixed with the icy silence of the snow. Küchler observed, approved, and continued. His orders were clear: strictness in the implementation of extermination policies. The duty of his subordinates was to obey. In the occupied territories, his soldiers marched under the grim directive of the Commissar Order, an infamous order condemning Soviet political officers to death as carriers of the Bolshevik plague. Without hesitation, Küchler promoted its enforcement. The prisoners of war who fell into his army's hands were treated not as humans, but as disposable objects. Later testimonies would describe thousands of prisoners dying daily in deplorable conditions, and though Küchler would later attempt to justify this as collateral damage of the war, the reality was plain. Toward the end of 1941, another order reached him: the execution of 240 mentally ill patients in Makarevo. Küchler approved without blinking. Once again, the machinery of war claimed the lives of the most vulnerable, while he continued firmly in his role, detached from the impact of his decisions. The occupation of the Baltic states became the scene of an even greater tragedy. Jewish communities, which had coexisted in the region for centuries, were systematically exterminated. The soldiers under Küchler's command collaborated with SS squads in mass shootings. Hundreds of mass graves dotted the landscape. Years later, when the war ended, Küchler was not brought to trial at Nuremberg, but his name appeared in multiple documents as an untried conspirator. Testimonies from former comrades and official documents pointed precisely to his actions, from the starvation inflicted on civilian populations to his cooperation with genocide perpetrators. His defense at the High Command trial, when questioned, revolved around excuses that seemed as hollow as the morality he once believed he possessed. The deaths of the Soviet prisoners were an inevitable result of the extreme climate, he argued with a certain cynicism. Kaltenbrunner, Mauthausen, and Italy, the brutality of an executioner. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was not just any officer. By the late 1930s, his grim demeanor and sharp cunning had already earned him notoriety within influential SS circles. A member of the Nazi Party since 1930, and the SS a year later, Kaltenbrunner quickly rose through the ranks of the Austrian SS. His stern, imposing, and unhesitating presence left a deep impression on those around him, and by 1938, when the Anschluss took place, he had earned the title of Brigadeführer of the SS. In March, under the wing of Arthur Seyss-Inquart, he was appointed Secretary of State for Public Security in Austria. This was only the beginning. He continued to rise, skillfully adapting to the shifting winds of the regime, so that when Germany extended its reach across Europe, Kaltenbrunner had already ascended to Chief of Police and SS in the Danube region, overseeing operations from Vienna. This tall man with a severe face, who rarely cracked a smile, knew every corner of his jurisdiction, and in those corners, anyone who dared to defy the regime inevitably fell. His network of control not only supervised every aspect of state security, but also extended into the persecution and repression of Jews, dissidents, and all those whom the Reich deemed deserving of being wiped off the map. But this was not enough for his ambitions. In 1943, he replaced Reinhard Heydrich as chief of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA. By then, he had no rivals in sight. He was at the top. The position in the RSHA gave him absolute control over organizations like the Gestapo and Kripo, making him the architect of much of the terror that swept through Europe. Kaltenbrunner did not just sign orders. He reviewed reports from operations in concentration camps, meticulously reading each statistic on the thousands of prisoners and the pace of the final solution. While other leaders of the Third Reich were entangled in grand speeches, Kaltenbrunner preferred silence, ruthless work, and efficiency. During his first visit to the Mauthausen concentration camp, his eyes scanned the scene with the precision of an anatomist. He himself ordered the execution of prisoners. This visit was neither casual nor bureaucratic. It was an inspection charged with a sinister intent, a message showing the lengths he was willing to go to fulfill the Reich's objectives. He supervised extermination methods and listened without a hint of compassion to reports on the use of gas chambers. When the situation began to escalate in Hungary and Italy, Kaltenbrunner did not hesitate. During a meeting, he declared without a second thought, "The eradication of the Jews in Italy is of utmost importance for the Reich's security." His word was law, his wishes, orders. Within weeks, thousands of Italian Jews were deported to extermination camps. In his speeches, though rare, he repeated that these acts were essential to protect the state, although those who heard him knew that the protection he referred to was nothing less than absolute control. His persecution was not limited to Jews. Kaltenbrunner also advocated for a severe campaign of repression against homosexuals in Germany. In 1943, he proposed a measure of mandatory castration for all convicted under the regime's anti-gay laws. Although this proposal was rejected by higher authorities, he continued to promote arrests, torture, and sentences. In his vision of purity, there was no room for those he and his peers saw as a threat to the health of the state. Meanwhile, European resistance grew stronger on several fronts, and wherever a rebellion arose, Kaltenbrunner's cold, ruthless hand was there. From his office, he sent precise orders to eliminate any sign of insurrection in occupied territories, pursuing and executing resistance members with methodical coldness. Then came 1945, and the Third Reich wavered. As Allied troops penetrated deeper into German territory, Kaltenbrunner watched his world collapse. In May, he was arrested by American troops in a cabin in the Bavarian mountains. There were no speeches or bursts of pride, just a man who finally seemed to understand that his days of power had vanished. During the Nuremberg trials, Kaltenbrunner tried to defend himself. He claimed ignorance of the most atrocious acts and insisted he was merely a subordinate following orders. But documents, photographs, and testimonies condemned him. It was impossible for someone of his rank, with his years at the heart of the RSHA, to deny his responsibility. There, under the inquisitive gaze of the judges, His impassive face bore witness to his own downfall. Finally, on October 16, 1946, Ernst Kaltenbrunner faced the last act of his life.